The bell tolled once, a hollow sound that drifted over the white fields like a breath held too long. Snow had fallen all night, soft and soundless, until the whole valley lay buried under a sheet of silver silence. At the edge of a forgotten mountain town, a small funeral gathered. No music, no choir, just the steady crack of frost beneath heavy boots. They said Edgar Holt had no family left. Only a handful of townsfolk came, more out of duty than affection. The grocer, the mailman, the priest. The wind did the talking for them, whistling through the broken fence posts of the cemetery, as if unwilling to let even this moment rest in peace. The coffin was plain pine, rough at the edges, a carpenter's mercy rather than a craftsman's pride. Someone had left a single daisy on top, now frozen solid. The priest cleared his throat and began to read, voice trembling in the cold. Though the body returns to dust, the soul shall. He stopped. A murmur rippled through the mourners. Heads turned toward the tree line. There, against the white expanse, something moved. Slow, deliberate, silent. A shape of fur, the color of fading fire. A bobcat. It emerged from the snow as if conjured by the memory of the man himself. Its coat shimmered under the dim light, spotted with frost, its eyes twin embers in the pale morning. No one dared to breathe. The animal stepped closer, paws sinking into the snow with the grace of something half real. A gasp broke from the crowd when it reached the coffin. It stopped beside it, not with fear, not with hunger, but with recognition. For a long, shivering moment, the world held still. The priest's Bible slipped from his hands, pages fluttering like wings. The bobcat lowered its head, brushing the edge of the coffin with its muzzle. Then it sat, just sat there, facing the cross, its breath visible in the cold air like smoke from a dying fire. Someone whispered, "Is it the same one?" Another voice, softer, "It can't be. It's been years." No one dared approach. The animal didn't move, didn't flinch at the voices or the snow that kept falling heavier now. It simply waited, as if guarding the man no one else had truly known. The priest finally found his words again, his voice shaking more from awe than chill. "We are gathered here to..." But he couldn't finish. Because in that moment, the bobcat lifted its head and released a low, mournful sound. Not a growl, not a roar, but something heartbreakingly human. A sound that carried through the valley like grief itself. Then, without warning, it turned and disappeared into the trees, leaving only paw prints that the snow began to swallow. When the silence returned, no one spoke. They simply stood there, staring at the tracks fading into the forest, and the question that hung heavy in every heart. Why had the wild come back to say goodbye? The cabin stood at the edge of the forest, like an old scar, weathered, stubborn, and unwilling to fade. Edgar Holt had built it 50 years ago with his own hands, using timber cut from the same woods that now threatened to swallow it whole. Time had bent the roof, cracked the porch, and dulled the color of the walls, but inside it still smelled faintly of cedar and tea leaves, the only warmth left in his world. Every morning, before the sun had the strength to pierce the mist, Edgar would light the stove. The match trembled between his fingers, not just from age, but from something quieter. That slow erosion of purpose that comes when a man outlives the reasons he once woke up for. He would brew his tea, pour it into a chipped cup, and sit by the window watching the snow creep closer to the door. The forest beyond was vast, indifferent. Pines rose like cathedrals, their crowns heavy with ice. Sometimes, if the wind blew just right, He could hear the mountains groan, that deep, ancient sound that reminded him he was only borrowing space from something much older. He didn't mind the solitude. At least that's what he told himself. The town was 12 miles away, and he went there only once a month to buy salt, oil, and a loaf of bread that always went stale before he finished it. People would wave politely, whisper when he passed. They called him the Hermit, though once he'd been the town's best hunter. Strong, quick, precise. That was before Margaret died, before the rifle grew cold in his hands. Now, instead of hunting, he fed the birds. He kept seed in a tin box by the door and scattered it over the snow every morning. Sometimes a fox came by, or a deer with ribs showing through its coat. They all came and went, never staying long. He envied that about them, the ease of leaving. At night, when the wind howled across the chimney, Edgar would talk to the empty chair by the fire, as if someone still sat there. "The snow's early this year," he'd murmur. "You'd have liked the quiet tonight." He always paused, listening, half expecting an answer that never came. There was something sacred about that loneliness, like a wound that refused to close because it remembered too much. Yet beneath it, deep down where the fire still flickered, something small refused to die. A longing for connection, for one more chance to be needed. And somewhere in the dark of the forest, that longing was about to be answered. It was the kind of cold that gnawed at bone, the kind that turned breath into glass and silence into something heavier than stone. That night, Edgar Holt sat beside the fire, wrapped in his wool blanket, listening to the wood pop and sigh. Outside, the storm had begun its slow assault on the valley, snow sweeping sideways, wind clawing against the cabin walls. He had gone to bed early, the kettle still warm beside him, when a sound pierced the wind. Faint, fragile, almost too soft to be real. A cry. Not human, not quite animal either. It came again, thin and broken, carried by the storm like a secret. Edgar hesitated. He knew better than to open his door on a night like this. The forest could trick the mind. Branches creaking like voices, ice cracking like footsteps. But there was something in that sound that wouldn't let him rest. He pulled on his coat, grabbed the lantern, and stepped outside. The snow was waist deep, the wind sharp enough to steal breath. His boots sank with every step as he followed the sound toward the tree line. The light from the lantern flickered, carving small shapes of gold against the storm's gray fury. Then he saw it, a small mound half buried in the snow, twitching. He knelt down. It was a bobcat cub, barely alive, its fur matted with ice and blood. One of its legs was caught in an old metal trap, rusted and cruel. Its breath came in sharp, desperate bursts, and when Edgar reached for it, the creature hissed weakly, baring tiny teeth that had no strength left in them. "Easy now," he whispered, voice trembling more from sorrow than fear. "I won't hurt you." The trap was frozen shut. It took him nearly 10 minutes to pry it loose, his fingers bleeding where the metal bit him. The cub didn't fight anymore. It was too weak to. When the trap finally released, Edgar wrapped the animal in his scarf and pressed it to his chest. Its heartbeat was faint, but still there. He carried it home through the storm, each step a battle. Inside, he laid it near the fire, wrapping it in a wool blanket. The animal shivered violently, then went still. For a moment, he thought it had died. He sat beside it all night, changing the bandage, whispering words he didn't even realize he was saying. When dawn came, light spilled through the frost on the window, touching the creature's face. Its eyes opened, gold and bright, burning against the pale morning. It looked at him, not with fear, but with something else, something almost human. Edgar smiled faintly. "You're still burning," he murmured, "like an ember that won't go out." And so he named it Ember, the last living spark in a house that had long forgotten warmth. For days, Edgar Holt tended to the small creature with a care that surprised even himself. He had not spoken to another soul in weeks, yet now his cabin echoed softly with the sound of his voice. Words meant not for man, but for something wild and broken. The bobcat cub, frail and half-starved, refused to eat at first. It would lie by the fire, eyes half-closed, its breaths shallow and uneven. "Easy now," he'd whisper, holding a bowl of milk near its muzzle. "We'll get through this storm together." He wasn't sure why he said "we." At first, the cub only hissed weakly, but hunger is a gentle persuader. By the third day, it licked from his hand, its rough tongue scraping his palm. That small act, so ordinary, so animal, nearly undid him. He hadn't felt touch in years, and now it came, from claws and fur, and it was enough. Outside, the world lay buried under endless snow. Inside, time slowed to the rhythm of healing, changing bandages, boiling broth, whispering words into the hush. Ember began to walk again, unsteady but determined, dragging its injured leg through the cabin like a soldier learning to march. Edgar caught himself smiling, the lines on his face softening. He spoke to it as if to a friend. "You've got fight in you, more than I ever did." At night, when the storm clawed at the shutters, Ember would press closer to the fire. Sometimes, when lightning flashed across the window, it would lift its head and stare at him. Eyes like molten gold, untamed yet curious. He felt seen, in a way that cut through years of silence. Still, he reminded himself, this was not his to keep. Wild things belonged to the wild. One day, it would go. He told himself he was ready for that, though in his chest, the truth whispered otherwise. On the 10th morning, the first sunlight in weeks slipped through the frost on the glass, painting the cabin in pale gold. Ember limped toward the door and sat, watching the light with quiet wonder. Edgar followed its gaze. The snow had stopped. The world outside looked new, untouched, like a chance to start over. He knelt beside the animal, his voice low, reverent. "Looks like the world survived the night," he said. The bobcat turned, met his eyes, and for the first time made a sound. Not a growl, but a soft, rumbling purr that rose and faded like a sigh. Edgar chuckled under his breath. "Guess we both did." And in that small cabin buried in snow, something unseen shifted, the line between man and beast, loneliness and belonging, blurring like breath on glass. That night, the storm returned with a vengeance. The sky cracked open, spilling wind and ice like punishment. Edgar Holt had reinforced the roof with spare boards that morning, but by dusk, the walls groaned under the weight of the storm. The old cabin trembled as if the mountains themselves were breathing down upon it. Ember paced near the fire, restless, its ears twitching at every creak. The wind howled through the gaps in the door, dragging snow across the floor. Edgar stoked the flames higher, but it did little to fight the cold that seeped through the wood. He tried to hum, a habit from his younger days, though the tune broke apart in his throat. Then came the sound, sharp, brutal, final. A beam snapped. Before he could move, part of the roof caved in, splinters flying through the air. The lantern shattered. Fire spilled across the floorboards like liquid sunlight. Ember let out a strangled cry and bolted toward the corner, trapped by fallen debris. "Stay there!" Edgar shouted, coughing as smoke filled the room. He grabbed his coat, threw it over the flames, but it wasn't enough. The air grew thick, unbreathable. The old man stumbled forward, blinking through the haze. He could see Ember, its eyes wide, glowing with panic. "I'm here, boy," he rasped, crawling toward it. The floor burned beneath his palms. A board gave way, sending sparks into his beard. Still, he didn't stop. When he reached the trapped cub, he pushed the broken chair aside, grabbed the small, trembling body, and pulled it to his chest. Ember scratched in terror, claws tearing into his arms. But Edgar didn't feel the pain. He kicked the door open with his boot, stumbling out into the storm just as the roof collapsed behind him. The sound was deafening, a roar of flame and wood and memory. He fell to his knees in the snow, clutching the Bobcat close. The cold bit hard, but after the fire's heat, it almost felt merciful. Ember shook violently in his arms, its breath short and frantic. Edgar pressed his face against its fur and whispered hoarsely, "You're all right. You're all right." When dawn finally came, the storm had died. The cabin was gone, only smoke rising from a blackened skeleton of timber. Edgar sat beneath a pine, his back against the trunk, arms wrapped around the sleeping animal. His clothes were frozen stiff, his hands blistered, but he smiled weakly at the pale morning sky. The Bobcat stirred, blinking at the light, then nestled closer into his chest. "Guess it's just us now," he murmured. "Two strays against the world." And as the wind whispered through the trees, the old man felt something he hadn't known in years. Not safety, not warmth, but meaning. For weeks after the fire, Edgar Holt lived like a ghost among ashes. The remains of the cabin stood black and silent, its smoke long gone but its scent still clinging to everything. A burnt memory he couldn't wash away. He rebuilt what he could. A lean-to made from fallen logs, a roof patched with tarps from the old shed. Crude, temporary, but enough to keep the wind out. Through it all, Ember never left. The Bobcat followed him like a shadow, silent but ever present. It slept near him at night, its warmth pressed against his side beneath the same threadbare blanket. In the mornings, it would slip away into the trees, returning by dusk with snow clinging to its whiskers and a mouse or small bird in its jaws. A gift, or perhaps a token of gratitude in the only language it knew. Edgar began to talk again, not to himself, but to it. "You hunt better than I used to," he'd say, watching as the animal tore its meal apart with fierce precision. "You remember what it's like to survive. I almost forgot." There was peace in their silence, a kind of understanding that didn't need words. He fixed a snare line near the creek, while Ember watched from a distance, head tilted as if studying his craft. When he fished, it waited by the riverbank, tail twitching, eyes following the silver flashes beneath the ice. At night, as the northern lights shimmered faintly above the dark peaks, Edgar would lie awake and listen to Ember's breathing beside him. It wasn't the steady hum of a pet, nor the distant rustle of a stranger. It was something in between, a rhythm that seemed to fill the space where loneliness used to live. Winter dragged on. The town saw little of him. Occasionally, the grocer would drive out with supplies, shaking his head at the old man's stubbornness. "You shouldn't stay out here, Holt," he warned once. "Ain't safe this deep in the season." Edgar only smiled. "Safety's a funny thing. Some of us find it in the woods." The grocer frowned. "And the Bobcat? Folks say you've tamed it." He laughed softly. You don't tame something like that. You earn its company, and only for as long as it allows. The man left uneasy, his tire tracks vanishing quickly under falling snow. That evening, when the wind began to rise again, Ember crept closer to the fire, curling against Edgar's leg. The old man rested a hand gently on its back, feeling the slow thrum of its heartbeat. You and me, he murmured, eyes on the flames. We're both too stubborn to die. The bobcat's ears twitched, and for a brief second, Edgar swore it understood him. Out beyond the trees, wolves howled, sharp and distant. The sound made the bobcat lift its head, gaze fixed toward the dark. Edgar followed its eyes and whispered, almost in awe, Don't worry. Whatever's out there, they'll have to go through me first. For the first time in years, he meant it. And somewhere deep in that frozen forest, a bond that was never meant to exist had quietly taken root. Fragile, improbable, but stronger than either of them yet knew. By early spring, the snow began to thin, and word of Edgar Holt's wild companion spread through the valley like wildfire. Hunters whispered that a bobcat had been seen walking beside a man along the creek, following him like a trained hound. Others claimed the old hermit had gone mad, keeping a killer under his roof. The sheriff came first, his horse kicking up gray slush as he rode through the forest path. He found Edgar splitting wood, Ember resting nearby atop a boulder, eyes half closed in the weak sunlight. "Morning, Holt," the sheriff called, his tone cautious. "Mind if I ask about your pet?" Edgar looked up, sweat glistening on his weathered face. "Not a pet," he said evenly. "A friend." "That friend of yours spooked the Anderson boy last week," the sheriff said. "Kid swears it stared him down on his way to the mill." Edgar smiled faintly. "Then the boy's lucky. If it wanted to hurt him, he wouldn't have made it home to talk about it." The sheriff sighed, rubbing the frost from his mustache. "You know the law, Holt. Wild animals belong to the wild. You can't just keep it." "I'm not keeping it," Edgar said, splitting another log with one clean strike. "It stays because it wants to." That answer didn't please him, but the sheriff wasn't cruel. He tipped his hat and said, "Just be careful. Folks fear what they don't understand." After he left, Edgar sat beside Ember, watching it clean its paws with calm precision. "Guess they'll always see you as a threat," he murmured. "Can't blame them. You've still got more mercy than most of us." Days passed. The bond between them deepened. Ember grew strong, its coat thick and golden under the warming sun. It hunted farther, sometimes disappearing for hours, always returning by nightfall. Edgar stopped worrying when it left. He'd come to trust that it would always find its way back. But the world around them was changing. Farmers in the valley began losing chickens and lambs to predators. Every morning, new traps appeared near the woods, jaws of steel waiting silently beneath snow. Edgar knew it wasn't Ember. It never hunted near homes. But convincing others would be harder. One afternoon, he found a rusted snare just yards from his shelter. He dismantled it with shaking hands, anger burning through his chest. "You'll not take this one," he growled under his breath. That evening, the grocer returned, more nervous than before. "They're talking in town, Edgar," he warned. "They want the cat gone. You should do it before someone else does." The old man turned away. "You don't understand," he said quietly. "It saved me." "From what?" "From being empty." The grocer had no answer. He left without another word, the sound of his engine fading into the trees. When night fell, The wind returned, sharp and restless. Edgar sat by the fire, staring into the flames. Ember lay nearby, tail flicking lazily, but its ears were alert, listening, always listening. "They don't trust us," Edgar said softly, "but maybe it doesn't matter. We know what's real." Outside, something howled. A wolf, closer than usual. Ember's head snapped up. The sound of the wild called to it, ancient and familiar. For a brief moment, Edgar saw the tension in its muscles, the instinct buried under its calm. He reached out, voice low but firm. "You're home," he whispered. The bobcat blinked, relaxed, and settled back beside the fire. And in that moment, Edgar knew the wild could live in peace with man, but only if both sides were brave enough to protect it. The morning it happened was gray and still, the kind of cold that made every sound ring clear as glass. Edgar Holt was chopping firewood near the edge of the trees, his breath rising in thin clouds. Ember had gone out before dawn, as it often did, vanishing into the mist toward the ridge. It always came back before noon. Always. But that day, noon passed. Then the afternoon waned into a sky of bruised light, and there was still no sign of it. A sick weight began to twist in Edgar's chest. He packed a lantern, a rope, and his old hunting knife, not as a weapon, but as a promise, and followed the tracks leading away from camp. The paw prints cut across the snow, steady at first, then dragging, uneven. Something was wrong. He found the bobcat near the stream, half buried in drifted snow. The sight hit him like a fist. Ember lay twisted in pain, one leg caught in a steel trap, blood staining the white ground. Its eyes fluttered open when it heard him, pupils wide with agony but still alive. "Oh God," Edgar breathed, falling to his knees. "Hold on, boy. Hold on." His hands shook as he tried to open the trap, fingers slipping on frozen metal. The rusted jaws refused to budge. He pressed harder, the steel biting into his palms until blood welled between his fingers. Ember whimpered, a low, desperate sound that tore through him like a blade. "Come on, damn you," he snarled through gritted teeth, using all his strength. The trap groaned, then gave way. The bobcat collapsed into his arms, trembling violently. Edgar ripped a strip from his coat and wrapped it around the wound, tying it tight to stop the bleeding. His breath came in short, ragged bursts, the cold forgotten. He stayed there for hours, holding the animal close, whispering nonsense. Words meant only to keep it awake. "You're all right. You're safe. Just breathe, that's it." By the time he carried Ember home, night had fallen. He laid it near the fire, built the flames high, and sat beside it without moving. The bobcat's breathing was shallow, but steady. Every so often, it would twitch in pain, and Edgar would rest his hand gently on its side, murmuring until it calmed. He didn't sleep that night. He only watched the fire and thought of traps, of the ones he'd set in his youth, of the lives he'd taken for sport, of how the forest must have hated him for it. Now it had given him this creature, this fragile, burning heart, and he would not fail it again. Outside, the storm began to rise once more, wind tearing through the pines. The snow fell heavy, but inside the lean-to there was warmth, a small fire, a wounded animal, and a man who had finally learned what it meant to protect, not destroy. When dawn came, Ember stirred weakly, lifting its head. Its golden eyes found his, filled not with fear, but trust. Edgar smiled through his exhaustion. "That's it, Ember," he whispered. "Keep burning." The bobcat blinked slowly, as if answering him, and pressed its nose against his wrist. The faintest gesture, but it was enough to break him. Tears slipped down the old man's cheeks, vanishing into his beard. For the first time in decades, he prayed, not for himself, but for the wild thing that had given him back his heart. Spring thaw came late that year. The snow melted in hesitant trickles, revealing the bones of the forest beneath. Mud, roots, forgotten traps. Edgar Holt's camp sat quiet by the stream, smoke curling from his chimney, a thin sign of life in the desolate green to anyone passing. Through, it might have seemed peaceful. But peace is fragile in a world that fears what it cannot tame. The first warning came from the grocer, panting as he trudged up the trail with a bag of salt and sugar. "Edgar," he said, voice low, "you'd better hide that cat. There's talk in town, men gathering for a hunt. They say it's been killing livestock." Edgar frowned, straightening from the woodpile. "That's not possible. It doesn't hunt near farms." "I know that," the grocer said, "but they don't, and they won't listen." From the ridge, Ember appeared, silent, regal, a ghost in tawny fur. It patted down to stand beside Edgar, golden eyes catching the sun. The grocer flinched, taking a step back. "You see?" he whispered. "That's what scares them. Look at it, it's too calm, too smart. They think it's cursed." Edgar's jaw tightened. "Then let them think what they want. I owe this creature my life." The grocer shook his head sadly. "It's not about what you owe. It's about what they'll do. Hunters are coming by weekend. Keep it close or let it go." When the man left, the forest felt heavier. Edgar stood still, the words echoing in his chest. Let it go. He looked down at Ember, who sat quietly at his feet, tail wrapped neatly around its paws. The thought of releasing it into the wild tore at him, but the thought of it being hunted was worse. That evening, he loaded his rifle for the first time in years. The metal was cold and unfamiliar in his hands. Ember watched him with an expression he couldn't quite name. Suspicion, maybe, or sorrow. "Don't look at me like that," he murmured. "It's not for you." But even as he said it, guilt bloomed deep in his chest. The line between protector and prisoner had never felt thinner. The next few days passed in uneasy silence. Ember seemed to sense it, its movements sharper, eyes flicking toward the tree line at every distant sound. The birds had gone quiet, and the wind carried faint traces of voices. Men, laughter, the metallic click of rifles. By the third morning, Edgar knew they were close. He packed what little he owned, preparing to move deeper into the forest. But Ember refused to leave the clearing. It stood at the edge of the trees, ears forward, watching something unseen. Then came the first gunshot. The sound tore through the stillness like lightning, echoing off the valley walls. Birds exploded from the branches. Edgar froze, heart hammering. Another shot, closer. And then, from somewhere beyond the ridge, a scream of pain that wasn't human. "Ember!" he shouted, dropping everything and running toward the sound. Snow and mud splashed under his boots. Branches clawed at his arms as he pushed through the underbrush. The echo of the shot still rang in his ears. But beneath it, faint and broken, came the sound he feared most. A wounded cry, fading fast. The forest seemed to close around him as he ran. Branches whipping against his face, roots clawing at his boots, the air thick with the metallic tang of gunpowder. Edgar Holt pushed through the brush, breath burning in his chest. "Ember!" he shouted again, voice cracking in the cold air. Then he saw it. A streak of tawny fur against the snow, dragging itself toward the creek. The bobcat was limping, one leg slick with blood, its coat matted with dirt. For a moment, Edgar thought he was too late, but when he dropped to his knees beside it, Ember lifted its head weakly, eyes still fierce despite the pain. "Oh, you poor thing," he whispered, brushing the snow from its muzzle. The animal blinked, breathing raggedly. The wound was bad, a clean shot through the shoulder, not instantly fatal, but cruel all the same. "Stay still," he murmured, pressing his scarf against the wound. "We'll get you home." A voice echoed behind him. "Step away, old man." Edgar froze. 3 men emerged from the trees, hunters, rifles slung low, faces hard with triumph and fear. The tallest one spat into the snow. "That's the beast. Took down 2 of my lambs last week. You're lucky we didn't shoot you too." Edgar's jaw clenched. "It didn't kill your lambs. It hunts alone, far from your land." The man sneered. "Don't matter. It's a wild thing. Wild things kill." He raised his rifle again, aiming at Ember. Edgar stepped in front of it without thinking, spreading his arms wide. "You'll have to go through me first." The hunter's eyes narrowed. "Move, Holt. Don't make this worse." "I said no." The standoff hung in the air, thick and electric. Snow drifted silently between them, a cruel contrast to the tension in their breath. Finally, one of the younger men shifted uneasily. "Come on, let's just report it to the sheriff. The old man's lost his mind." But the leader wasn't listening. His finger hovered near the trigger. "Step aside," he growled. Edgar didn't move. He could hear Ember's labored breathing behind him, each rasp a thread tethering him to something worth dying for. "Don't do this," he said quietly. "You'll regret it." The hunter hesitated, not out of mercy, but because of what he saw in the old man's eyes. Not madness, but conviction. Something ancient, unyielding. After a long silence, he lowered his gun slightly and muttered, "You're a damn fool, Holt." Then he turned and walked away, motioning for the others to follow. Only when their footsteps faded did Edgar collapse beside the Bobcat. His whole body trembled, half from cold, half from rage. "You're safe now," he murmured, though he knew it was a lie. The world outside that forest would never understand. He tore his sleeve, bound the wound tight, and whispered as he lifted the limp animal into his arms, "We'll make it through this. You hear me?" Ember made no sound, just pressed, its head weakly against his chest. For the first time in his life, Edgar realized how small the line was between being human and being hunted. That night, the fire burned low. Edgar Holt sat beside it, coat stiff with dried blood, the Bobcat lying motionless on a blanket near the hearth. The wound had stopped bleeding, but its breathing was shallow, too shallow. He'd done all he could, cleaned it, stitched it, prayed in words he hadn't spoken since Margaret's funeral. Outside, the forest was quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that came before change. "You've got to fight," he whispered, voice trembling. "You're tougher than this. You've always been tougher." Ember's eyes flickered open. They were duller now, but still that same gold that had once burned so fiercely. It tried to lift its head, but he pressed a hand gently against its neck. "Rest. You're safe here." The animal exhaled a soft sound, not a growl, not pain, something in between. A goodbye that didn't need words. Edgar stayed up all night. He told stories about the river in summer, about his first hunt, about the wife he buried long ago. He didn't know why he was talking. Perhaps he was afraid that silence would finish what the bullet started. When dawn came, light spilled through the torn fabric that served as his roof. He turned to check on Ember and froze. The blanket was empty. He rushed outside, heart pounding. The snow was new, untouched except for a single trail of paw prints leading into the forest. Each step was smaller than the last, the tracks dragging where the injured leg faltered. "Ember!" he shouted, his voice echoing into the hollow valley. No answer came, just the whisper of wind through the pines. He followed the tracks for miles, until they disappeared into the stream where ice and water swallowed all signs of direction. There, he stopped. He stood alone in the biting wind, breath fogging, eyes burning with something far deeper than sorrow. "She left to die alone," he murmured, "because that's what wild things do." But even as he said it, he didn't believe it. He knew the creature, knew it better than he'd ever known another living soul. It hadn't run from him. It had gone somewhere it believed he couldn't follow, somewhere beyond pain, beyond traps, beyond men and their guns. He returned to the ruin of his cabin and sat beside the dying fire. The place felt smaller now, emptier than ever. Every creak of wood sounded like an echo of her steps. Every breath of wind carried the ghost of her cry. That night, for the first time in years, he didn't light the fire. He just lay awake in the dark, staring at the ceiling, whispering her name into the silence. And outside, in the distance, faint and uncertain, came one last echo, a cry so soft it might have been the wind. Or maybe, just maybe, the wild saying goodbye. Winter came early that year, cruel and unrelenting. The valley froze beneath its own breath, rivers sealed under glass, trees cracking like bones in the cold. Edgar Holt was older now, thinner, slower, a man worn hollow by waiting. It had been almost a year since Ember disappeared, yet not a day passed that he didn't glance toward the tree line, hoping to see those golden eyes one last time. But the forest had stayed silent. His hands no longer had strength for the axe, and the fire took longer to start each morning. He spoke less, moved less, as if the world had begun to forget him. Even the birds that once gathered near his camp avoided the clearing now. He'd taken to sleeping in a chair beside the window, facing the woods. The cold crept into his bones at night, and sometimes he thought he heard her, a faint cry in the distance, a phantom echo of what once was. He knew it was only the wind, but part of him chose to believe otherwise. One night, the storm returned, sharp, endless, alive. The sky split with lightning, and snow fell thick as ash. The roof moaned under the weight of it. Edgar stirred, breath coming shallow, the fire dimming to a dull glow. He reached for another log, but his fingers slipped, weak and unsteady. "Not tonight," he murmured to the dark. "Not yet." Then, from outside, came a sound. A low growl, deep, familiar, impossible. He froze, heart thundering. For a moment, he thought his mind had finally betrayed him. But then came another sound, the crunch of footsteps in the snow, heavy but graceful. A shadow passed the window, large, fluid, feline. The door shuddered once, then again. With trembling hands, Edgar lifted his lantern. "No," he whispered. "It can't be." He unlatched the door. The wind howled in, scattering snow across the floor. And there, standing in the storm, was Ember. No longer the frail cub he'd once rescued. She was magnificent now, her coat full and thick, eyes brighter than firelight. Scars ran along her shoulder, a pale memory of the bullet that once nearly ended her. For a moment, they only stared at each other, man and beast, the living and the lost. "You came back," Edgar breathed, voice cracking. Ember stepped forward, slow and deliberate. The wildness was still there, that unbroken strength, but beneath it shimmered something gentler: recognition. She brushed past the threshold, snow melting under her paws, and lay beside the dying fire as if she had never left. Edgar sank to his knees beside her, laughter and tears tangled in his throat. "You stubborn thing. I thought you were gone." He reached out, hesitated, then touched her fur. Warm, real, alive. Outside, the storm screamed. Inside, the fire caught again, flames licking upward as if the house itself exhaled. For hours, he didn't move. He simply sat beside her, feeling her breath rise and fall, steady, patient, certain. It was as though the wild had returned to guard what it once owed. And when he finally whispered, "Well, why now?" the bobcat only blinked, slow and knowing, before closing her eyes again. That night, the old man slept soundly for the first time in years, the warmth of the fire and the rhythm of her breathing pulling him back from the edge of death. The storm did not end with dawn. It deepened, grew teeth. Wind screamed through the valley, tearing branches from their roots, hurling snow sideways like shards of glass. The cabin creaked under its fury. Inside, Edgar Holt awoke to the sound of splintering wood. Ember was already up, tense, ears flicking, tail lashing in sharp arcs. She stood at the window, her breath fogging the cracked glass. "What is it?" Edgar asked, voice hoarse. His chest ached with every word. Cold had settled into his bones like rot. The answer came in a groan, the roof beam shifting under the weight of ice. A moment later, half the ceiling gave way, snow pouring in, extinguishing the fire in a hiss of smoke. The sudden cold hit like a fist. "Damn it!" Edgar gasped, struggling to his feet. The door rattled against its hinges, nearly torn free by the wind. He tried to brace it, but his strength failed him. The world spun in white fury, and he fell to his knees. Ember moved instantly. She leapt across the room, landing between him and the falling debris. Her body took the blow of the beam, a sharp crack splitting the air. She hissed in pain but held her ground. "Go!" he shouted. "Get out of here!" But the bobcat didn't move. Instead, she pressed her head against his shoulder, forcing him toward the door, her muscles trembling under the effort. It took him a second to realize she was trying to get him out. He stumbled forward, leaning on her strength, step by step through the collapsing cabin. The door burst open, and they fell into the storm together, man and beast tumbling into the snow. Outside was chaos. The wind howled like a living thing, biting and endless. Edgar crawled toward the tree line, his hands raw, his lungs burning. Behind him, Ember limped heavily, her shoulder bleeding anew where the beam had struck her. "Come on," he wheezed. "Just a little farther." They reached the old pine grove, the same place he had found her all those years ago. The wind screamed around them, tearing at the branches. Edgar collapsed against the trunk, coughing hard, his vision blurred, edges dimming. Through the haze, he saw Ember pacing in circles, restless, desperate. She pressed her body against him, trying to shield him from the snow, her fur thick and warm against his chest. Her heartbeat thudded strong, steady, a rhythm against the storm. "Why'd you come back?" he whispered through cracked lips. She lifted her head, meeting his eyes, and in that silent exchange, he understood. She hadn't come for food or warmth or safety. She'd come because he had once done the same for her. Hours passed in fragments, flashes of light, darkness, the endless wail of wind. Edgar drifted in and out, clinging to the faint pulse beneath his hand. Each time he slipped toward sleep, Ember nudged him awake with her nose, a quiet insistence that he stay. When the storm finally broke, morning came slow and weak. The valley lay buried, silent again. Edgar stirred, breath shallow but alive. The bobcat still lay beside him, her fur crusted with ice, eyes half closed in exhaustion. He reached out, fingers trembling, and brushed the frost from her cheek. "You saved me," he whispered. Ember blinked once, slow, deliberate, before resting her head on his lap. Her breath was shallow, her body still. And in that stillness, under the broken light of dawn, it was impossible to tell which of them had rescued the other. When the storm finally passed, silence returned. Heavy, absolute, as if the world itself paused to catch its breath. The snow stretched endless and unbroken across the valley, untouched, but for 2 sets of prints that led to the shelter beneath the pines. Edgar Holt woke to a weak light pressing through the frost-laced branches. His body ached with every heartbeat, but he was alive. He turned slowly, searching for the familiar rhythm beside him. Ember lay curled in the snow, her fur stiff with ice, her chest rising and falling in shallow rhythm. She was breathing, but barely. "You stubborn thing," he whispered, voice thin as the wind. "You should have left me." He reached out, his gloved hand trembling as it found the rough warmth of her neck. The bobcat stirred, golden eyes opening halfway. They met his gaze, weary, steady, knowing. "Rest," he murmured. "You've done enough." The sun began to rise, weak but determined, spilling light through the trees. Snowflakes drifted down lazily, melting on the old man's beard. He smiled faintly at the sight. The forest that had once seemed so cruel now looked almost holy, every branch glimmering like glass, every shadow softened by dawn. He thought of Margaret then, her laughter by the river, her hands mending his torn shirts, the way she had called him stubborn and kind in the same breath. He thought of the cabin they built, the life they buried, and the years that followed, empty, until a wounded creature stumbled out of the storm and taught him how to feel again. "You were my second chance," he whispered, his breath fogging faintly in the cold. Maybe that was all I needed." He leaned back against the pine trunk. The ache in his chest deepened, but it no longer frightened him. A strange peace filled the spaces where pain used to live. He looked once more at Ember, whose eyes had closed again, and smiled. "Sleep well, girl," he said softly. "The fire's yours now." Then the wind quieted, and everything slowed. His heartbeat, his breath, even the world itself, until all that remained was stillness. Time passed. The light grew stronger. The snow melted where it touched his face, and then Ember stirred. She lifted her head, as if sensing something had shifted. She pressed her nose against Edgar's hand, waiting for movement that never came. For a long moment she stayed there, unmoving, unblinking, as if refusing to accept the silence. Finally, she rose. Her body trembled from exhaustion, but she stood tall. The wind brushed through her fur, carrying the scent of pine and smoke and the faintest trace of him. She turned toward the horizon, where the sun climbed above the mountains, painting the snow in gold. Before she left, she lowered her head and brushed her muzzle once more against his sleeve. A final gesture, gentle as breath. Then she walked into the forest without looking back, her paws leaving perfect imprints behind her. When the villagers found Edgar days later, they found him sitting upright beneath the tree, a faint smile frozen on his face. His rifle lay untouched beside him, and next to it, a trail of paw prints leading away into the wilderness. They said the prints never faded, no matter how the snow fell. The bell tolled again, the same hollow note that had once echoed across the valley on bitter winter mornings. The villagers gathered at the edge of the frozen field, bundled in wool and grief, their breath clouding the air. The world was pale and still, the sky washed in shades of ash. The coffin was simple, carved by the carpenter in town. No ornaments, no fancy polish, just plain pine, like the man himself. A few flowers, already frozen stiff, rested on top. The priest stood beside it, his gloved hands trembling as he turned a page in his worn Bible. Edgar Holt, he began softly, was a man few of us truly knew. He lived alone, far beyond the town's edge, and yet, somehow, he touched more lives than we realized. Murmurs of agreement passed through the small crowd. The grocer wiped his eyes with a sleeve. The sheriff, normally stoic, bowed his head. No one spoke above a whisper, not out of formality, but reverence. There was something about the quiet that felt sacred, as though the forest itself was listening. A young boy, maybe 10, tugged at his mother's coat. "Mama," he whispered, "is it true? The cat's real?" "Hush," she said, her voice tight. "It's just an old story." But then the wind shifted, a slow, cold gust rolling down from the ridge. Every head turned. From the mist beyond the trees, a shape emerged. At first, it was only movement, a ripple in the snow. Then the figure came clear. Lean, graceful, fierce. A bobcat, coat glinting with frost, eyes glowing gold beneath the gray sky. The priest's voice faltered. Someone gasped. The sheriff took an involuntary step forward, hand hovering near his sidearm before realizing what he was doing. No one moved after that. The bobcat walked straight through the crowd, silent as wind, leaving no sound but the crunch of snow under its paws. It stopped before the coffin, head lowered. For a moment, the world seemed to stop breathing. Every flake of snow, every whisper of air hung motionless. The animal touched the edge of the coffin with its muzzle, then sat, calm, still, watchful, as though guarding him one last time. The priest lowered his head. "Amen," he murmured, voice breaking. "Even the wild grieves its own." The boy clutched his mother's hand tighter, whispering, "It came back for him." The woman said nothing. She only watched, tears freezing on her lashes. For a long, fragile minute, no one dared to move, and in that stillness, it became clear. This was not a tale of man and beast, but of two souls who had simply found each other in the cold. Then, as quietly as it had arrived, the bobcat rose and turned toward the forest once more. The crowd parted like water, eyes wide, hearts pounding. No one stopped it. No one could. The mourners began to drift away as the priest closed his book, his voice swallowed by the wind. One by one, boots crunched softly against the snow, leaving shallow trails back toward the road. The bell had stopped tolling, but its echo lingered in the frozen air, a sound that seemed to hang between heaven and earth. Only the bobcat remained. It sat beside the mound of freshly turned soil, tail curled neatly around its paws. The golden of its eyes caught the dimming light like embers refusing to die. A few villagers lingered at a distance, whispering in awe. "Should we try to chase it off?" one of the men asked quietly. The sheriff shook his head. "No, let it be." His voice was steady, but his eyes shone with something he didn't quite understand. Respect, maybe, or guilt. The grocer stood nearby, hat in his hands. "I told him to let it go," he murmured. "He said it saved him. Guess he wasn't wrong." Snow began to fall again, light, slow, almost gentle. The bobcat didn't flinch. It sat as if carved from stone, eyes fixed on the grave, unmoving even when the drifts began to gather around its paws. The sight silenced every whisper, every thought. Hours passed. The gray of afternoon faded into the bruised blue of dusk. A lantern was lit near the church, its glow faint against the oncoming night. The last of the villagers hesitated before leaving, glancing back one final time at the strange guardian that refused to leave its post. By twilight, the churchyard was empty but for two things: the grave of a man who had loved the wild, and the wild that had loved him back. The wind softened, sweeping gently across the snow. Somewhere deep in the forest, an owl called, low, mournful, ancient. The bobcat turned its head slightly, listening. Then it looked once more at the grave, its breath visible in the cold, and pressed its forehead lightly against the mound. For a moment it stayed that way, motionless, reverent. Then it rose, slow and steady, and stepped back. Its tracks glowed faintly in the starlight as it walked toward the Atson trees. It paused once at the edge of the forest, turned, looked back. No one saw it leave, but those who were watching from their windows later swore they heard a soft cry, not of sorrow, but of farewell. And when morning came, the snow had settled smooth and perfect again, except for one thing: the trail of paw prints leading from the grave toward the mountains. They stopped where the first rays of sunlight touched the ridge, as if the creature had simply walked into the light. Years passed, and the valley changed. The road was paved, the old church repainted, and the forest crept closer each season, reclaiming what men had once cleared. But some things refused to fade, like stories whispered beside fires, or paw prints that never truly vanished beneath the snow. Children in the town grew up hearing about the hermit and his bobcat. Parents told it as a warning first, a tale about loneliness, about taming what should not be tamed. But the older folks, those who had stood at that winter funeral, told it differently. They said it was not a story of taming, but of trust. Sometimes, when the snow fell early and thick, hunters swore they saw a shadow moving along the ridge, sleek, silent, with eyes that caught the lantern light and turned it to gold. None dared to shoot. They said it was her, the guardian of the mountain, still keeping watch over the man who once saved her. The sheriff, long since retired, would sit by the bar's window each winter evening and tell newcomers, "I saw it with my own eyes. That cat sat by his coffin like a mourner." His voice would always soften at the memory. Never seen anything so human in something so wild. The grocer's son, now grown, rebuilt the small cabin by the stream. He said it felt right somehow, like the woods wanted it there. Sometimes he'd find claw marks on the doorframe, faint but fresh, and a single paw print by the fire pit. He never swept it away. And on certain nights, when the moon was bright and the air sharp with frost, the valley would fall utterly still. No wind, no owls, not even the whisper of trees. In that perfect silence, if you listened hard enough, you could almost hear it. A low, familiar sound rolling through the dark. Not a growl, not a cry, something gentler, a sound of remembering. Those who heard it never spoke above a whisper after. They said it was Ember, calling for the one who had loved her without fear, or maybe just reminding the world that kindness leaves echoes no storm can erase. At the churchyard, the grave remained simple. A wooden cross, the name Edgar Holt carved by hand, half faded from weather and time. Yet every first snowfall of winter, the villagers would find the same thing waiting there: A single trail of paw prints circling the mound, and a patch of snow left untouched at its center, as if something had lain there through the night. The priest would only smile when asked about it. Some bonds, he'd say, don't end. They just change shape. And when the wind swept through the valley, stirring the trees into quiet song, it always carried with it the faintest whisper, wild, mournful, and full of love. They say the world forgets easily, names, faces, even kindness. But sometimes, when a story is pure enough, it finds a way to stay. It lingers, quiet as falling snow, waiting for the right heart to remember. Years after Edgar Holt's death, the valley changed hands, maps, and generations. Yet each winter, when the first snow blanketed the ridge, someone always left a lantern burning by his grave. No one knew who started the tradition, and no one dared to end it. Travelers would stop by the churchyard and see the flicker of that lonely flame against the white. They'd ask about it, and the townsfolk would tell the story. The man who lived with a wild creature, the one who saved it, and how it returned when the world had already given up on him. The story spread beyond the valley, through word, through wonder. People called it a miracle. Others said it was just nature's echo. But those who truly listened understood it wasn't about miracles or beasts at all. It was about what happens when compassion crosses the boundaries of fear. Some claimed the bond between Edgar and Ember was something holy, proof that the world still held secrets too beautiful to measure. Others said it was simply a reminder that everything alive, no matter how wild, hungers for connection. On certain nights, when the wind carried just right, travelers swore they could see a figure on the ridge. An old man in a wool coat walking beside a golden shape, their shadows blending into one. The priest said it was only snow and moonlight, but when he prayed later, his voice trembled. Perhaps it doesn't matter what was real and what wasn't. What mattered was that for a time, in a world full of walls and guns and cold, two souls found each other. And that was enough to warm an entire valley for generations to come. And maybe that's what love truly is. Not something we hold, but something we leave. A mark in the snow. A paw print beside a footprint. Fading, but never gone. When the first storm of each winter rolls through the mountains, the wind sometimes hums low and deep, like an old lullaby. The trees sway, and the stars blur behind the clouds. In that sound, if you listen long enough, there's a heartbeat. Faint, distant, eternal. Some say it's the earth remembering. Others say it's the wild mourning. But those who knew the story of Edgar and Ember simply smile, because they understand. Sometimes the wildest creatures remind us what it truly means to be human.